Washington is full of noise, but here we cut through it. I'm Ryann Hill, your trusted voice on healthcare, aging, and disability policy. On Mic'd Up, I sit down with the people driving change to share their stories, insights, and strategies in the Beltway and beyond. Welcome to Mic'd Up with Ryann Hill. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Mic'd Up with Ryann Hill, where we shape policy and elevate voices. Today is such a special episode for me because I finally get to bring one of my own onto the mic. And really not just anybody. I'm talking about a true strategist, a funding whisperer, and the woman who keeps reminding me and our clients that policy without money is really just words on a paper. We have on the episode today, Ebony Slaughter-Johnson, who is our vice president at Indigo Hill Strategy. She leads all of our federal appropriations. She does excellent government affairs work. She's a graduate of Princeton and Harvard Law, truly a great person to know in DC. I've known her for years, but all of our conversations up until I think last summer were about her impeccable fashion choices at our networking events. So when we were thinking about, as a firm, formally expanding our appropriations practice, it was really intentional, and we wouldn't have done it with anybody beyond Ebony, because the truth of the matter is you can draft a bill, you can build the coalition, you can secure the champions on the Hill, in the administration, in the White House. But if you don't secure the funding, that impact is going to stall and you won't see the end goal that you want. I think one thing I really appreciate about Ebony is that she really understands how Washington works. She understands the power of the purse, as they say in DC on Capitol Hill. She understands the committees and the timing, which is always very critical. And really, she knows how to translate all of that into real resources for the communities and clients we serve. I'll just do a quick little story, Ebony, if you don't mind. I didn't tell you I was going to do this. So I hope you don't mind. So at Indigo Hill Strategies, we believe in bringing up the next generation of policy leaders. And so we always have a fellow on staff, a fellow or two. Last fall, we had two fellows on staff, one of which is about to graduate from his master's program. And so he is no longer a fellow with us. So we have one fellow right now. So last fall, Ebony comes to us and we decide to start a brown bag lunch special event for the firm, where we bring in someone who knows something super well and can teach us whatever this thing is that they know, and we can think about, okay, do we want to incorporate this in the company, but also just like learning, right? Like it's our duty as we are building up this next generation of policy leaders to teach them as much as possible, and truly, selfishly, to teach us and the staff too, because there's so many things that we may not know. So we bring Ebony in last fall for maybe a 2-hour brown bag lunch on appropriations. We sort of know appropriations, right, at a cursory level, but I said, why not bring on somebody who knows it? Like her eyes light up when she talks about it. So we had a fantastic 2-hour brown bag lunch where she's teaching us appropriations. And at the end of that brown bag lunch, I said, oh, I really don't want to do that. It was so complicated, so complex. And it's one of those things where, like, the more you learn about it, the more you realize you don't know what you don't know. And so after a couple more conversations with Ebony, she agreed to join the firm and lead appropriations for us and our clients. And it's just been an amazing few months with her on team. So today we want to bring her on so she could pull back the curtain on federal appropriations, talk about what it is, why it matters really now more than ever, and how organizations that are thinking about things in smart, intentional ways can start to think about a funding strategy in this climate. So why don't we get to it, Ebony? You okay with that?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. So let's start by telling the people who you are and how you became this appropriations powerhouse.
Okay. Well, I'll start by saying, Ryann, what a generous introduction. Thank you so much. Thrilled to be on the podcast today, and thrilled to be working with you every day. This partnership has been really a dream come true for me.
I don't pay her to say that, folks.
No, she doesn't. That's fully voluntarily. Let's see. My background, as you mentioned, is in law. I started my legal career at a corporate law firm in Washington, D.C., and kind of stumbled into our legislative and public policy practice group, i.e., federal lobbying. My path to law school was an interesting one. I didn't love the inherently adversarial nature of the law. I'm definitely a more diplomatic, more collaborative
Yeah,
person,
you definitely
and
are.
so thank you for saying that. I try to practice what I preach. And so to have the opportunity to work in federal lobbying, where the essence of my work is building coalitions, particularly at this time with people who may not necessarily have the same perspectives as I
Mm.
do or same perspectives as my clients, is really a dream come true. And my interest in the appropriations process is that legal writing, as some of you may know, is very dry. It's very bland. You're not going to generate a lot of excitement internally reading a legal brief or legal memo or judicial opinion, honestly. But when you're drafting a federal appropriations request, it's really this awesome opportunity to engage in narrative writing because you're trying to be as persuasive as possible. And it's truly about storytelling. You're trying to tell the most compelling story you possibly can on behalf of your client, or on behalf of your organization, explaining what they do, and how federal funding will allow them to take their current operations to the next level and really serve their communities. And I think the reason why players in the healthcare landscape should be aware of what's happening on the federal appropriations front is because it's a huge pot of money that can make your operations possible, that can help you do things that you've only ever dreamed of, and that directly impacts the patients and potentially very vulnerable patients that these organizations serve.
So, like, it's very clear to me, and I'm sure to everyone listening and watching right now, you love this. And so imagine 2 hours of us, like, of her, like, breaking this down and answering our incredibly fundamental questions. It was absolutely fantastic. So why don't we start here? When people, i.e., maybe myself a few years ago, heard the word appropriations, we would either panic or tune out. I think that's especially true in present day, where there's a constant talk about government funding and shutdown and earmarks, and it just feels like this giant word cloud of all these things. And I know that so many people would just prefer to stay away. So can you break down what is federal appropriations? I know you touched on it a little bit, but to go a little bit deeper here. And why should folks in healthcare, aging, disability, universities, hospitals, et cetera, why should they care and engage in the process?
Okay, sure. And apologies, Ryan. I think I may have gotten a little ahead of my skis.
No, no, it's great. I'm so
You know how
excited.
much I enjoy
No.
talking about my beloved appropriations process. So I should say at the start, when I talk about federal appropriations, I'm talking about, as Ryan mentioned at the start, Congress's Article One, power of the purse, and we're talking about discretionary appropriations. These are the opposite of mandatory appropriations, and these discretionary appropriations go to fund previously authorized federal agencies and programs. And so I think that I'll echo what I said earlier. You cannot have a meaningful legislative strategy without the money undergirding it. And again, the federal appropriations process distributes a lot of funding to different federal programs and agencies that they then filter down to providers, to researchers, to support organizations, to advocacy organizations that really makes their work possible. And if you're only focused on, I guess, the tradition, what we know is the traditional legislative side of engaging federal partners, you're only doing half the work.
Mm-hmm.
You're missing out on a major opportunity to further serve your clients, your populations, your communities.
And I also feel like in congressional sort of eras past, right, appropriations wasn't as contentious of a process as it is present day, right? We know that like there's an incredible narrow majority with Republican leadership in the House, right? The Senate is also more narrow than we've seen in previous years, and it just feels like now more than ever we're talking about appropriations so much more, right? Where like maybe 10, 20, 15, 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, if you had that legislative component, it may have been a little bit easier, right, to work across the aisle, to be bipartisan, to make sure that you had the authorization and the appropriations piece sort of in lockstep. And it feels like we're just in a different place now, which I think is to lead to the question. I feel like the moment like appropriations right now matters so much more. When we were starting Indigo Hill Strategies, a lot of the questions that we got from potential clients was on appropriations. And, I think you did a good job outlining sort of the mandatory and discretionary spending. Most of my career has been in that mandatory spending bucket, right? I've done Medicare Advantage, dual eligible work, working with state Medicaid. And so for me, I'm like, yeah, I can sort of do a cursory level. I can submit requests, right? I can maybe even draft some testimony as one does. But there's a whole layer here that like, you have to really understand the process and also who the key players are, right? Because a lot of the members of Congress, are on the appropriations committees. They're also subcommittees, right? There's the healthcare, the labor rights subcommittee. There's all these different things, and these players who as a majority of my work has been in healthcare, as a healthcare lobbyist, I may not have had to interact with some of these offices or some of these staffers on the mandatory spending work that I did. So I want to echo, I want to sort of translate that into why right now. When you joined us back in January, you wrote an excellent blog, which we'll make sure to link in the comments and in the show notes, on really what federal appropriations is and why it matters now more than ever in this moment. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening now in Washington that makes the funding strategy just as important as the legislative strategy? As you mentioned, they have to go hand in hand.
Yeah, so what you're seeing now, I think, is a reflection of what you just mentioned, tight margins in the House and the Senate. And that means you really need to be thoughtful about how you're crafting your request, what type of request you're going to pursue, who your champions are, because they need to be, when we do lobbying, always needs to be strategic, but in appropriations you need to have like the right mix of footprint members, so the members who are representing wherever your organization, your institution, what have you, are based. Those are really going to be your foot soldiers, and you need to have the support of appropriators. And additionally, because those margins are so tight, the request has to appeal to a broader swath of ideological sentiments. It's also more important, I think, to have a broader swath of community support as well. And because I think right now the spending environment is relatively restrictive, you have to be thoughtful about how much you're asking for, where exactly that money is going to be put to good use. I think additionally, the healthcare sector, healthcare players in the healthcare landscape are facing a unique challenge because, as I mentioned in my blog post, there are a lot more pressures on the mandatory side of things, Ryan, which you're very familiar with. Thinking specifically about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I got to count out. I got to count out the letters.
All the B's.
And I think that because some of that mandatory funding has been redirected to other purposes. A lot of players in the healthcare field are now looking at the discretionary side of things, and that creates more pressure to have a really stellar, really competitive request. And I'd like to think that that is where we come in as people who are familiar with the process and familiar with the targets that we're pitching to.
And I want to drill down for a second on sort of folks who have been relying on the mandatory side, and now that's getting squeezed tighter and tighter, right? And the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill and the $880 billion that it's expected to be cut from state and Medicaid programs across the country. From the conversations that we have with clients, with folks who are just interested in healthcare, aging and disability especially, but this is going to touch every industry, right? Like, we've been hearing a lot of really concern and frustration from folks who at stateside who are like, okay, well, if my state's Medicaid program loses funding, that means that the state can no longer fund these other programs, right, that the state is funding. And therefore, they need to find alternative vehicles for funding of those programs, right? And I know a lot of folks are turning towards philanthropy, right, private foundations, and they're also, if you think about it, if they only have a certain amount of money, they're also getting inundated, right? And I think that's where the federal appropriations piece provides an option, for a real option, solid option for people who, when you think about it, as you mentioned, I think you did a great job mentioning all the key players in the appropriations process, right? The members of Congress, the folks in the House who represent these districts where these programs might be, or these facilities might be, the senators, right? And I know that those are two sort of separate, but separate processes in the House and the Senate, but they can often work together in terms of building champions and support. I just wanted to drill down for folks that appropriations needs to be a part of their funding strategy, especially for folks who are thinking about, if you have $880 billion cut from Medicaid across the nation, right? What does that mean for care coordination? What does it mean for hospitals that may be looking to expand facilities based on certificates of needs they got at the state from their state legislature, but now they have to sort of rethink that process because they were expecting sort of a certain payer mix to come through and fund some of their activities. They need to now look at the federal appropriations process. And think appropriations now, which is why we wanted to bring you not only on the podcast, but on the team, is that this is something that a lot more people need to start paying attention to. I think it used to be that, as I mentioned earlier, you hear appropriations and you think, what? Or you get scared, or some people honestly would get icked out about appropriations because you think about, earmarks and people sort of putting money to the side for different projects, right? And so it can feel, for folks who don't understand it, like an icky process. What I'm hearing from you very clearly, Ebony, is that it's not an icky process, right? It's a complex process in which you need an expert navigator to help you sort of make sure that you're crafting a narrative that works, and also a narrative that is, I think, sensitive to, the political times that we're in, right? And doing it in a way that can be appealing to everybody. One thing I talk about all the time is, I was speaking to a Republican member of Congress a few months ago, and he said to me, Ryann, we're getting a lot of vinegar. We need some honey, right? And I think appropriations, as DC as I'm about to sound, appropriations can be that honey for people, right? It can be that process. And I cannot believe I just said that as somebody who's spent the vast majority of their career on the mandatory spending side. But you have to give people an opportunity to support you, right? And your organization and your mission and your vision. And they can't support you if they don't know what the need is, right? And if you're not putting yourself out there, engaging with appropriations experts to help you navigate that process, then your request is I mean, one, if you know that you can submit a request, right? Two,
Yeah, yes,
if
yeah,
you're
yeah.
doing it on your own, right, without sort of that broader context, it's going to be harder for you to get that pocket of money. And then all the folks that are turning to the private donors or the philanthropy organizations, the foundations, are that money is going to be squeezed tightly as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. So
And
what?
oh, I was just going to say super quickly, and I should have mentioned this at the top. There are different categories of federal appropriations. I've been kind of grouping them together, discussing them as one in my previous comments. But just quickly, I'll make the
Yeah.
distinction. There are programmatic appropriations. So that's funding appropriations where you're requesting a specific dollar amount that is either an increase represents an increase from previous years, or represents a decrease from previous years, or is level, or you're requesting a programmatic language request. So that can be bill language, which has the force of law. Literally, that language request would be reflected in the actual appropriations bill, or we're talking about a report language request, which goes into either the House report, the Senate report. Sometimes they both have equal weight, or when the House and Senate conference a bill or bills, they'll develop conference reports in the form of joint explanatory statements. And that report language request is kind of a request to Congress to direct the applicable agency to consider some sort of change, to be mindful of X, Y, or Z, or to prioritize X, Y, and Z, things like that. Then on the other side of things, we have an earmark request. Now those are called congressionally directed spending requests, or community project funding requests. I like earmarks, short, sweet, simple. But
It resonates. Yeah.
yes, you mentioned the vinegar and the honey, and it made me think, oh, okay, I should probably talk about the distinction. And the earmark requests are just the perfect encapsulation of the honey component of federal funding. It's honey from the perspective of organizations, institutions, because it's specific funding that goes towards a specific project in a specified community, and really can be transformative, particularly for nonprofit organizations. Those are who are eligible for these earmark requests these days, particularly for nonprofit organizations to serve their communities. And they can make up gaps in funding that we talked about earlier. Perhaps trickle down from funding restrictions on the mandatory side, and from private donors tightening their purses as well. But there are also really great ways for members to point to tangible investments in their communities. Like from an earmark request, you can say, these dollars helped serve X amount of new patients, created X amount of new jobs. They help stand up X number of facilities throughout the district. And so I really think both sides benefit. Earmarks have historically been controversial, but I think I really think they're a crucial way to bring in new community development.
Yeah. And I'll also say, I think you make an excellent point about, the fact that both sides could benefit. Like it's a win-win-win, right? I think for a lot of these organizations, as you were talking about, as you were sort of detailing that, I'm thinking like, yeah, you can have, a draft a press release, right? Like for, when you find out that you've been awarded this funding, draft a press release, right? Create a campaign to thank the member of Congress. And again, this is regardless of party. Like this stuff is what members of Congress love, especially in the House, right? Where they're up for re-election every 2 years, giving them some, like, this is really that honey for them. And again, something that, one, the appropriations process has to happen, right? I mean, in theory.
Yes, exactly.
Happen, right? Like, I think traditionally you have folks who they approach advocacy from the perspective of either trying to get a bill, like a big bill like the Older Americans Act, reauthorized and funded, right? And that may be sort of the grand opening, grand closing, to quote Jay-Z, of their sort of appropriations or funding activity. But they need to think more about sort of what can be funded, how it can be funded. There are all these different, like what I've learned working with Ebony, there's all these different like pockets of money in like across the federal government that like people was qualified for, right? And so it's about one, knowing that those pockets are there, and then two, writing a really solid, case for why this organization, this area should get that pocket of money is really helpful. But I often think like, again, people think that nothing is moving in Congress, so like we don't even want to approach legislation, and we don't even want to talk to members of Congress or their staff or whatever, because it's a really tense time. We'll give you that. It's really divisive right now. We'll give you all of that. But I will say that, like, I think appropriations for me feels like the only thing that moves, or the only thing that happens, right?
I think that's right.
It feels like Congress, I say in theory because we, last year in 2025, we saw the longest government shutdown in U.S. history, part because they were trying to figure out like how do we fund different parts of the government. Can you talk a little bit about if appropriations is all that is, I say all that is moving, is the vast majority of what's moving? How can an organization like tap in? Like how do they follow? And where we are now too, like now we're on FY 2027 appropriations. Like, can you talk about that process and what an organization can do?
Yeah, I really think that, and it's an excellent point, and I totally agree with you. The appropriations bills are really the only moving vehicles reliably coming out of Congress. And I think that means, again, new pressures on organizations to think clearly about think clearly and think creatively about how they can shepherd their requests through Congress. I think in previous Congresses, which maybe were more productive, you'd of course go through what we know as the standard legislative procedure, but bills are not moving the way they want to. Like we can literally look and compare how many bills were passed by previous Congresses compared to the Congresses we've seen in the last
and I'll just
years.
say, I think we saw that this is the least productive Congress in congressional history, right? That productivity, when people say that, when those numbers come out, it's about like the individual bills that are passing, right? Like appropriations is moving. And I think most consistently, again, because we have to fund the federal government, and that's why you see, the appropriators in Congress are often the most successful when it comes to leadership, right? I'll give you an example. Nancy Pelosi was an appropriator, right? The Appropriations Committee is the most powerful committee, and they have to think about strategy from so many different perspectives. Ebony, I we have a lot of folks listening who are outside of the Beltway. We've talked a lot about the process and why it's important, but like it might be helpful for folks to get an understanding of like what kinds of things can they submit requests for. Like let's try to make it as real as possible for the folks listening.
Yeah, you can submit an earmark request, again, to fund specific project, a specific undertaking. So in the context of health, that can be equipment to conduct medical research. Those requests are quite popular because they are so concrete, and there's, I think, a direct, through line between the request, the item, for lack of a better word, and the community impact. You can, of course, as I mentioned before, request a language request. And when I was talking before about organizations and advocates being more thoughtful about using the appropriations process to move their priorities along, I was thinking specifically about programmatic language requests, because rather than going through a bill, you can request that Congress direct agencies to perform a specific action. Now, as I mentioned before, that request does not have the same force of law. It's more of a guidance, a suggestion, but still, a win is a win.
Yeah.
So I think
So you could do something like, and again, I feel like I'm still learning about appropriation, so the audience and I are going to learn together. So
yes.
you could do something like if you are maybe a state area agency on aging, right? You could
Hmm.
fund, for example, a senior meal delivery program
Hmm.
under the
Hmm.
Older Americans Act or under the Administration for Community Living. Like you can do things like that that have a tangible
Hmm.
impact on the community, on the people that you serve.
Hmm.
I think the equipment example is such a good example. I know we talk a lot about hospitals that are trying to
Hmm.
do requests for expansion sites, right? If they want to build
Hmm.
another facility to serve their communities, that those are all like really solid examples of like why this
Hmm.
is so important. You can fund, fund research. You can fund
Yes.
data collection programs, right, like the CDC's data collection programs for sickle cell, for
Yep.
example, research
Sure.
funding
Yeah.
programs that maybe your organization or your community depends on, right? You can then take
Hmm.
the charge of funding those programs within the federal government.
Yes. Yes, definitely. And I'll pick up on your example to better illustrate what I mean when I talk about programmatic language requests. In the context of the sickle cell disease example, um, so there's a sickle cell disease demonstration treatment program, and so you would request that Congress ask the agency to prioritize the implementation of the treatment program in high poverty areas or in rural communities. So that type of thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think as folks are thinking about their federal strategy, right? Like what I really want to connect the dots on is that, lobbying, regulatory work, research, appropriations, they all have to talk to each other, right? Like if you have a strategy, a federal or even a state strategy, right? That's really dependent on the existence of some of these research programs, right? You can make that appropriations request to make sure that that funding is there to achieve your own strategy goals, right? Your own
Mhm.
federal
Mhm.
or state strategy, regulatory goals. And then, you have excellent appropriators, appropriations policy experts like Ebony to shepherd the process, but also Ebony's just a great lobbyist in general, right? So like she's always on the hill, she's always building relationships, and so it's important to have someone who can help you navigate the submission process, but also to follow up, right? To build that relationship
Mhm.
with the congressional office, with the member of Congress, really so that when the request is submitted, they're like, oh, yeah, we know Ebony well. We know Ebony wouldn't
Mhm.
bring us anything that didn't make sense. We know that
Mhm.
This is going to be a very well thought out request. And then because
Mhm.
that relationship exists, right, it is, I mean, we can't make any promises because we work in politics, right? But because that relation, it makes an easier process, I think, for everybody involved. Would you agree with that?
Mhm. Mhm. I absolutely would. And I would say the demand for appropriations specialists is higher now because we've seen some really interesting moves out of the
Hmm.
Trump administration, in the sense that they have, I think, been withholding funding that has been previously appropriated by Congress. I mentioned that Article 1, power of the purse, that uniquely belongs to Congress. We've seen the Trump administration withhold that funding on the back end. And so I think in previous cycles, you always wanted to make sure either you or your lobbyist was making sure that funding was properly dispersed. But now
Mhm.
it's actually a requirement. Like you'd be remiss if you did not make sure that funding that was appropriated by Congress was actually distributed to the places that it's supposed to be distributed to, because the Trump administration has kind of been eschewing those congressional demands. Additionally, I think we've seen attacks on earmarks before, but I personally think those attacks are starting to ramp up. There's been controversy over like specific earmarks, in the sense that I know in the House, some Republicans were really up in arms about an earmark request submitted by Congressman Omar, and
Mhm. Mhm.
they were so successful in rallying against this request that they got it thrown out. Additionally, on the Senate side, Senator Lee proposed an amendment that would have totally just wiped out an entire class of earmarks from a specific bill. That
Wow.
that amendment was unsuccessful, but it means that advocates and their lobbyists now are entering a stage where they need to be more diligent about what's happening both on the front end, shepherding the requests through Congress, um, but also on the back end of making sure that
Yeah.
the request does
That you
not get
protect it through
thrown
the
out
process.
at the last minute. Yes,
You
ironically, yes, to
protect it through the
protect it from the
process. Yeah.
process and to be on proper footing to potentially, defend it against the Trump administration.
Yeah. 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 Ebony, it's been absolutely fantastic. So great. I'm just so proud to have you leading this work. As folks can see, she loves it and is so smart at it, and it is so much more complicated than I realize. And again, as someone who spent my career on the mandatory side, and I'm sure all of our listeners are going to be like, "Yeah, I can see why she's on the team." So, Ebony, thank you so much. I think what
Thank
we've
you.
hope what our audience has hopefully learned here today is that appropriations doesn't always feel like the flashiest in policy and politics. We don't often see it like trending on X or Twitter or social media. It doesn't always make the headlines. I think now we've seen it make the headlines more because of the government funding issues.
The
But the
drama.
impacts, yes, but the impacts are real for appropriations, and that's where people can really see opportunities to continue to do the work that they love to do so much, and really help improving people's lives. And I hope that that's what our listeners can really take away from this. If you're in healthcare, aging, disability, or really any mission driven space, funding strategy cannot be an afterthought anymore. It has to be a crucial part of the conversations, which is why we have Ebony on, I think, most of our client calls at this point. She's been a key fixture for almost all of our clients that are especially in the not in the mandatory spending space. So, it means that research, policy analysis, the lobbying piece, it all has to be coordinated, and also I would add communications to that too, right? Like we all have to work
Hmm.
together.
Hmm.
And that's where our business partner Maddie comes in at Beltway Solutions Group, because she is I call her the word girl. She is the communications maverick, and she helps us sort of weave through. Okay, if we want this strategy to go through, this is how we need to think about it or talk about it. Because at the end of the day, excuse me, communities do not experience a lot of the legislative language, right? They experience the funded programs. And so all of those things working together is why it's so important to really engage in this work in a really intentional way. And I know, from our audience, they can probably tell we can talk about this all day. Well, I can listen to you talk about appropriations all day because you're just so good at it, and you can tell that you really have a heart for this work. So I want to thank you for your leadership, the leadership that you bring to this firm as our very first vice president, but also to our clients. I'm just really, really excited for what we're going to do next as a firm, with your appropriations practice. So Before I close, I do need to give a sincere thank you to our sponsor, Rex Wallace Consulting, for supporting Mic'd Up with Ryann Hill and really helping us to create this space for these really important policy conversations. And to everyone listening, if this conversation sparked something for you, if you realize your organization might need a stronger funding strategy, you know where to find us. We'll again put Ebony's really great introductory blog post in all of the comments when we post the episode. So this is Mic'd Up with Ryann Hill. Until next time, we'll be in touch.
We all know quality isn't optional. Success in Medicare Advantage and Medicaid demands relentless focus, using data, engaging providers, elevating member experience, and embedding quality in your culture. At RWC, quality is our DNA. Our clients outperform the industry, and our Net Promoter Score of 94 says it all. Whether you're aiming for 4 stars or exceeding Medicaid benchmarks, redefining success in Medicare and Medicaid begins with RWC, because we catalyze cultures of quality.